Hello, listeners. It is now 2026, and let me be the last to wish you a very happy new year. At least, I hope I'm the last. It's halfway through February. Several weeks ago, I rang in the new year at a small family gathering at which someone turned on the TV about 10 minutes before midnight to watch the ball drop in Times Square. I've always loved the kitschiness of the ball drop. I've always loved New Year's Eve in general. I love how relatively unproblematic it is. Almost everyone celebrates it, whether at a party or just by staying up late. And if they don't, it's just because they're tired, not because they are morally opposed to it. Also, there are no preparations necessary. No gift exchange, no feast, no cards to be mailed. It's such an agreeable holiday. Something we are in desperate need of, in my opinion. We need something that can bring us all together, at least occasionally. Something other than tragedy. But what do we have? Religious holidays are, as we are well aware, not celebrated by everyone. And even the supposedly unifying American holidays like July 4th and Thanksgiving are hard to feel totally good about, either because of modern-day politics or because of some pretty shameful historical events. Halloween is innocent fun for some and pure evil to others. The so-called Hallmark holidays, like Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, and Father's Day, ones that have been invented or co-opted primarily in order to sell us stuff, are also inherently exclusive, intended only for a certain demographic, and for the rest, well, those days might carry enormous grief or hopelessness. Memorial Day and Labor Day have become almost interchangeable 3-day weekends bookending summer, during which it is just as traditional to go out of town with your family as it is to gather together and barbecue with your neighbors. St. Patrick's Day is cool, if you're into reliving your college drinking days. Mardi Gras is cool if you happen to live in New Orleans. The Super Bowl comes pretty close, but not everyone cares about football, and besides, half the spectators go home angry and sad. I could go on. The point is, New Year's Eve has always felt like the one day of the year when we can all come together and not only agree on something, but get kind of ridiculously excited about it as well. The new year is celebrated across aisles, religions, time zones, borders, cultures, and classes. It's almost heartwarming. But as I watched the throng of people huddled together in their holding pins, shivering through the final minutes of their voluntary captivity, resolute in their decision to wait for it, determined to be there at the time and place of greatest importance. As I watched them, it suddenly struck me not as heartwarming, but as a literally chilling spectacle of humankind's total regimentation to the clock. New Year's Eve is a grand symbol of our complete dependence on, accommodation to, and even worship of clock time. Today, we're talking about what clock time hath wrought upon humanity. Not only what it has made possible, but also how it has changed us at a deep level. And whether or not it might still be possible to wriggle out from under its tyrannical tick-tocking, even if just for a little while. I'm Ellen Riccio, and this is First Creatures. I want to say a little more about exactly what struck me that night as I watched the countdown. Here were 1 million people gathered to celebrate what amounts to coordinates on a man-made grid, a time zone and a time, and a date on the calendar. These are conventions which are either arbitrary, as in the middle of the night marking the beginning of the day, or which are only loosely connected to natural events, namely the winter solstice, for those of us here in the northern hemisphere, the day, or night, it's tough to say, when we begin our slow tilt back towards the sun. I wondered how many of these million people had celebrated or even been aware of the winter solstice 10 days earlier. Not many, I would wager. I mean, I didn't celebrate it either. Celebrating the solstice is somehow a weirdo move in this day and age. It's witchy, pagan, hippie, new agey, or at the very least, alternative. Yet, the solstice is actually a real phenomenon, much more real than midnight on January 1st. But midnight on January 1st feels more real to us, and seems to be much more consequential. And maybe it is more consequential in this world we've built. It doesn't matter so much to us anymore what the sun is doing. We're no longer beholden to when the sun rises, when it sets, the fact that days are sometimes long and sometimes short. If the sun sets in the late afternoon, we might feel a little bit sad, or a lot sad, but we're still going to continue on with our day, which ends when we say it ends, at more or less the same time all year round. To us, the sun is weather. Sometimes it's out, sometimes it's not. It does not dictate anything. The clock dictates everything. Whereas ancient people worshipped the sun and recognized that it was the source of their very lives, we get together and cheer on a clock. Go clock, beat sun! I imagined 1 million people getting together in Times Square to celebrate being part of a system, a solar system, larger than themselves, instead of celebrating a system that we've created, all-powerful beings that we are. What struck me was how divorced, some might say liberated, we are from natural ways of perceiving time. My next thought was, well, no wonder it's so difficult for us to linger. The clock is king. We bow down to it. We obey it in even the most private aspects of our lives. We hear it ticking in the silence, urging us on to the next thing, making a mockery of our mortality. It's hard to relax. It's been hard to relax, I would argue, ever since this thing was invented. I'm not talking about time measurement devices in general. Sundials, water clocks, and fire clocks had been in use for thousands of years in many parts of the world by the time the mechanical clock came on the scene in the late 13th century. It's not clear exactly whom we have to thank for its invention. It was more of a gradual evolution, one that wasn't terribly well documented. What is clearer is why such a contraption was needed in the first place. It was so that people could pray at exactly the right times, specifically Christian people in the Roman branch of the church, ones that lived in monasteries, to be precise. But let's back up. Religious people had been praying at certain times of day for a long time. The Jewish tradition is to pray 3 times a day, after daybreak, before sunset, and after dark. In Islamic tradition, it's 5 times. At dawn, just after noon, before sunset, just after sunset, and after dark. These are fairly approximate by our standards, but it wasn't a complete guessing game either. The devout took their cues from nature. This is reflected in the first morning blessing in Jewish tradition, which praises God for giving wisdom to the rooster to distinguish between day and night. The rooster, that snooze-buttonless alarm clock. And then, also according to Jewish tradition, the evening prayer could be said as soon as 3 stars were visible in the night sky. And if it was a cloudy night, one waited until one could no longer distinguish between blue and black. For early Muslims, not within earshot of the call to prayer, the salat would not be performed at specific points in time, but rather during specified spans of time, say, between dawn and sunrise, or from when the shadow cast by an object is once or twice its length until sunset. So, why weren't these methods sufficient for the Benedictine monks of the 13th century? Well, for one thing, Christians had to pray a lot more times, at least in those days. Ideally, according to the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Thessalonians, one should be in a state of ceaseless prayer. But the early Christian theologian Tertullian recognized the impracticality of this ideal and recommended instead that the faithful should pray privately at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours of the day. This was in the 3rd century, a full millennium before the appearance of the mechanical clock. So what was he talking about when he said the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours? Well, at that point, it was already common practice to divide the day into 12 equal parts. In fact, this practice dates all the way back to ancient Egypt and was later adopted by the Greeks and Romans. Each day began at sunrise and ended at sunset, which we now think of as happening at different times throughout the year. But in this way of thinking, sunrise and sunset were constants. Within the span of the day, time was divided into 12 equal hours, and then grouped into 4 quarters. So, speaking in our terms, if sunrise were at 6 a.m. and sunset were at 6 p.m., the 3rd hour of the day would be like our 9 a.m., the 6th hour our noon, and the 9th hour our 3 p.m. So that's what Tertullian was talking about when he suggested that people pray at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours, in addition to the regular morning and evening prayers. This was the first instance of prayer times being set according to a clock of some kind. But again, Tertullian was addressing this advice to regular people, suggesting that they pray privately at certain times to sort of approximate being in a state of ceaseless prayer. These were not hard and fast rules. Precision was not paramount. And if you missed a prayer, there weren't likely to be any eternal repercussions for your negligence. Not so in the monasteries, where the monk's vocation was to pray and pray often, thereby saving the souls of all the people whose worldly duties, or restlessness, prevented them from fully devoting themselves to a holy life of service. Saint Benedict in the 6th century expanded on the Tertullian prayer schedule by outlining a few more distinct daily prayer times: vigils, or matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The first of these, vigils, was performed in the wee hours of the morning, meaning that the monks had to rise from bed in the middle of their night's sleep so that they could pray synchronously for maximum impact with their brothers. And because the rooster has not been granted the wisdom to distinguish between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., mercifully, I might add, the need for an alarm clock rose. This was the original purpose of the mechanical clocks that appeared in the 13th century. They were more like timers than displays of time. Up until the 14th century, they didn't have faces and ticking arms, just an internal mechanism that caused a bell to ring once a certain amount of time had passed. This history is actually contained in the word clock, which comes from the Latin word for bell. Imagine for a moment that you carry in your pocket not a smartphone, not a pocket watch, but a timer that can be set for a few minutes or for several hours. And you use it whenever it's really important that you know exactly how much time has passed. Say, when you're boiling an egg, or when you need to wake up well before dawn so that you can, bake bread for the whole town. Otherwise, you don't have any appointments. You just do what needs to be done, or as much as you're able to do, or as much as you want to do. Stuff takes as long as it takes. Your life is a series of experiences, not an invisible and ill-fated march of minutes and seconds. You broadly measure your life in days, months, and years, and the finer articulations of time take the form of your heartbeat, your breath, your footsteps, and, notably, music. However, you do have that timer in your pocket, so mechanically precise minutes and seconds are there for you to use whenever they might be of service to you. Needless to say, this is not how it went down in 14th century Europe. It wasn't long before the clock spread beyond the monastery and began to regulate the lives of workers and merchants. In urban centers, bells rang for start of work, meal breaks, end of work, closing of gates, start of market, close of market, assembly, emergencies, council meetings, end of drink service, time for street cleaning, curfew, and so on. The emerging medieval textile industry depended heavily on the clock, or was made possible by it. Workers gathered at appointed hours in dye shops and fulling mills, concentrating their efforts for maximum impact, much like the monks, though in an earthly realm. Some branches of manufacture could be conducted in workers' homes, which employers preferred because it shifted some of the overhead costs to the workers, and the workers preferred it to working in the large shops because no one was looking over their shoulder and telling them when to start and stop working. But there was a problem. Workers were paid by the garment or piece they produced. When the market demanded more of their product, employers tried to incentivize workers by raising their pay, but guess what? The workers were not interested in earning more than they needed. In other words, by raising the pay per garment, employers were actually reducing the number of garments the workers needed to make in order to earn what they felt was enough. Enter the clock. If employers paid workers by the hour and demanded that a certain number of hours be met, they could finally meet the demand for their product. Et voila, time was money. Sometimes employers themselves would pay to install clocks in towers that would signal to all home workers when to start and stop working. In his superlative book from 1934, Technics and Civilization, Louis Mumford writes, "Was it by reason of the collective Christian desire to provide for the welfare of souls in eternity by regular prayers and devotion that timekeeping and the habits of temporal order took hold of men's minds, habits that capitalist civilization presently turned to good account? One must perhaps accept the irony of this paradox." The clock, Mumford argues, was the key machine of the modern industrial age, not the steam engine, which was usually credited. Just think of what the clock made possible in the realms of transportation and production alone. Mumford puts it succinctly, "The clock synchronized the actions of men." Basically, it harnessed our collective power on a massive scale, and that power has made some pretty remarkable things possible, even as it has been abused. But the misuse of the clock is not confined to the ways that the man used it to squeeze more out of all of us. It's how all of us used the clock to squeeze more out of ourselves. What started out as timekeeping, again, imagine using your pocket timer or stopwatch, to measure real things for a specific reason with some useful outcome. What started out as timekeeping turned into time serving, and time accounting, and time rationing. Time discipline and obedience to the clock became virtues. We began to believe in time as an independent world of mathematically measurable sequences, totally dissociated from human events, to borrow from Mumford again. And then we began to accommodate ourselves, our messy, impulsive, forgetful, error-prone, moody human selves, to that abstract world, doing things like scheduling our day down to the minute in a color-coded Google Calendar and wondering what's wrong with us when we fall hopelessly behind. But again, time-measuring devices had been around for centuries. What was it about the mechanical clock that made it so much more influential in the lives of common people? A few things. One was the fact that it was simply more accurate and reliable. It was impervious to cold, unlike water clocks, and could be used at night or on cloudy days, unlike the sundial. Another was the fact that it had a face with the practically still hour hand, a creeping minute hand, and a tick-happy second hand, all of which translated movement through time into movement through space, beckoning to our imaginations with the promise of control. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it was because the mechanism could eventually be made to be quite small. Common people could have a clock in their house and soon in their pocket, and then on their wrist. Having a clock face constantly in view was fundamentally different from hearing a bell ring throughout the day, not to mention hearing a rooster crow. In his 1983 book, Revolution in Time, David Landis writes that the chamber clock was an ever-visible, ever-audible companion and monitor. The turning hand is a measure of time used, time spent, time wasted, time lost. As such, it was prod and key to personal achievement and productivity. The clock may have been instrumental in the industrial age because of its ability to synchronize the actions of men, but even in our current age, the digital age, when so much happens asynchronously, the clock still occupies a central place in our lives, whether we are on or off the clock. Even with no one looking over our shoulder and telling us what to do, when to start and stop working, pressuring us to use our time well and wisely and efficiently, the clock itself seems to be looking over our shoulder constantly, and we submit to it. We can hardly blame our medieval predecessors for embracing the clock so readily. You can bet that you would have wanted more control, more regularity, and more power, too. And it would be hypocritical of us to shake our fists at the clock too vigorously, considering that we are all chilling in some pretty sweet accommodations, as compared with those of medieval peasants, or royalty for that matter. And needless to say, there is no turning back the clock. Our whole world hangs on its every utterance. It will not be overthrown, and we wouldn't want it to be. But it doesn't always have to be in charge either. We can obey it when it is required or expected of us, or when we personally find it quite useful, without letting it dominate our entire existence. It might take a little mental effort on our part, but I believe that we can still experience time in a pre-clock manner. Granted, it will only be temporary, unless you plan to leave society forever and live off the land. But the fact that it will be temporary doesn't mean that it is not worthwhile. I am suggesting, sort of like Tertullian was saying in the 3rd century, that while it might not be possible to break away entirely from our responsibilities and obligations and live in a state of constant communion with the spirit of life, that it would still be beneficial to the world for us to check in with it on occasion. Just as one of the games I talked about in episode 4 challenged us to see the natural world without imposing language on it, now we're talking about sensing time without imposing minutes on it. So how do we do this? Well, a few ways come to mind. The first one is really earth-shattering, and it is just don't look at the time. How long you're able to do this will depend on your particular circumstances, of course. The most extreme conceivable example would be to take an entire day, or perhaps multiple days, on a weekend or when you're on vacation, and not only put your phone away, but refuse to look at a clock of any kind, and kindly request that you not be given the time either. Listen to your body for cues of when to eat, rest, or move. See where the sun is in the sky, and try to get a sense of how much daylight is left, and imagine what you could do before sunset. Try to sense how much energy you have left to give to this day. This is a more intuitive way of perceiving time. The medium version of this would be hosting a dinner where everyone agrees not to check the time until a 4-inch taper candle burns out. Or it could be you just personally deciding to take the rest of the day off from clock time once you're, done synchronizing your actions with other humans. You make dinner, relax, and go to bed when you're tired. You'll get back on clock time in the morning when it really matters again. The smallest version of this would be to set out to complete a task or an exercise or an outing, regardless of how long it takes. You could decide to walk to a coffee shop that you might normally drive to, leisurely finish your beverage, then walk home, never once checking the time. Or, rather than squeezing in a 20-minute workout, you could decide to do a set number of exercises or a certain sequence of yoga postures and let it take as long as it takes. Or you could count 30 breaths rather than meditate for 5 minutes. But it could also mean deciding to do a household chore or home improvement project without looking at the clock until it has been completed. The idea is just to shift your focus onto the task at hand, onto something tangible and, frankly, real. Another pretty cool way to have a different experience of time is by giving it to another person. Once you make the decision to give your time to another human being, not just to begrudgingly let them take up your time, but to really give your time to them, with both feet in the door, so to speak. Whether it's to share something with them, or serve them, or help them, listen to them, or just to be with them. You are yourself delivered from that constant pressure to determine whether you are wasting your time or spending it well. You're no longer spending it or wasting it. You're giving it. Talking about time as something we spend or fill points to what the German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer called empty time. When we're bored, experiencing time as an agonizing presence, or frantically busy, never having enough time to do all the things we need to do, he says that both extremes represent time in the same way, as something empty that can and must be filled. In neither case is time experienced in its own right. But Gadamer says there is another experience of time that is possible, and he proposes to call it fulfilled time, or autonomous time. I think I may eventually dedicate an entire episode to these ideas, but I wanted to give a brief overview here. An example of fulfilled time would be a festival, one that involves an entire community, a massive shared experience. In his 1977 essay, The Relevance of the Beautiful, Gadamer writes that a festival is, quote, a community in which we are gathered together for something, although no one can say for what it is that we have come together. So imagine a gathering on the scale of New Year's Eve in Times Square, only no one can say exactly what it is they're celebrating. They're just there to celebrate. They have gathered for the purpose of gathering, united by the simple intention of setting aside their individual pursuits for a while, to be caught up in a crowd. All businesses have closed for the occasion. Everyone has agreed not to work, so you don't have to worry about falling behind. If you don't know what I'm even talking about right now, it's probably because we don't really have festivals like this in today's culture. Festivals were much more common in previous ages. In fact, many of the holidays I mentioned at the beginning of this episode were once festivals belonging to public life. But we still catch glimpses of this festive character when we gather in large groups or celebrate something properly, i.e., with both feet in the door. When Gadamer talks about autonomous time, he's referring to the idea that each living being exists in its own time. To illustrate what he means, he says that it is clear that children do not mature and adults do not age smoothly and gradually, but in spurts. We suddenly become aware that someone has aged, or that someone is no longer a child. In this sense, the clock is completely beside the point. A work of art, he says, also exists in its own time, according to its own set of rules. In order to come into contact with this other kind of time, Gadamer says we must learn to tarry with art. To tarry means to stay or linger, longer than is intended or necessary. I want to close by telling you a quick story that illustrates this last point. I grew up in the 90s when cassettes were still in use and MP3 players were starting to come on the scene. But there's no question that CDs reigned supreme. One day when I was 9 or 10 years old, I was listening to Yo-Yo Ma's recording of the Dvořák Cello Concerto on my family's stereo system. If you don't know this piece, I hope you'll listen to it as soon as this episode is over. It is an outrageously beautiful piece of music, and it begins with this colorful and evocative orchestral introduction that's kind of epic, so that before the cello soloist even comes in, the listener has already been swept away on a daring adventure. Well, anyway, that's how I heard it as a kid. So there I was in the living room, probably dancing around and closing my eyes and imagining all sorts of fantastic things as I listened. The music was taking me far, far away, to another time and place. Then, quite by accident, I happened to glance at the display on the CD player, and it said this horrible thing. Track 1, 337, 338, 339. My heart sank as I watched those seconds pile up at a tempo that bore absolutely no relationship to that of the piece. The idea that this point in the music could correspond in some way to something as profane as 3 minutes and 37 seconds deeply offended me. If you had asked me how much time I thought had passed, I might have said, 10 years. Of course, I knew that this was impossible, but I also knew that it was true, in a Never Never Land sort of way. The music had taken my little imagination to such soaring heights that 10 years felt like an appropriate metaphor for the depth of experience I'd just had. Dvořák created a world which all of us are now able to enter, where minutes and seconds can't touch us, provided we don't invite them in with us. Support for First Creatures comes from our listeners. Thank you to everyone who has signed up for monthly donations, including our newest supporters, Deborah Diaz-Granados, Chris Eden, Sarah Whiting, and Emily Smith. To learn more about First Creatures and to find out how you can support the podcast, visit firstcreatures.com. Thanks for listening.